In the cold belly of the North Atlantic, where sunlight vanished beneath waves that whispered of death, the ocean itself had become a weapon. It was 1942, the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, and every convoy that dared to cross from Britain to America carried not just supplies, but the fragile hope of survival. Beneath those steel gray waters, Hitler's U-boats hunted like wolves, unseen but always listening. They were ghosts armed with torpedoes, guided not by sight, but by sound. And in that endless game of cat and mouse, silence was life. Any ship that made a noise, a propeller's hum, a metal clang, a misplaced echo, might as well have signed its own death warrant. It was a war of frequencies, of sonar pings, of whispers and explosions, where survival often depended on who could disappear first. But this is not the story of a commander, or a scientist, or a hero with medals and ranks. This is the story of a man no history book remembers. A cook. A man who stirred soup in a galley on a convoy ship called the SS Carnarvon Castle, and who, with an idea so insane it bordered on madness, would change the sound of war itself. He wasn't supposed to matter. His name, lost now, blurred by the waves of time, was never written in any admiralty record. To the men on board, he was simply Cook, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw and burns on his forearms from years spent near boiling pots and coal-fired stoves. Each morning, he rose before dawn, washed in water so cold it numbed his fingers, and began his routine in the galley. While others manned guns or checked compasses, he peeled potatoes and stirred porridge. But it was in that monotony, in that narrow steel room filled with steam and the hum of engines, that he noticed something no one else did. When the sea was rough and the engines groaned, the pots on the stove vibrated strangely. The sound of boiling changed. The bubbles shifted pitch with every roll of the ship. He could almost feel the sound travel through the deck plates beneath his boots. And one day, when a pot lid clanged and the hum beneath him vanished for a moment, he realized the noise from his kitchen was drowning out something deeper, something mechanical. That night, in the galley, as storm waves crashed and the ship's hull trembled, the cook had an idea. What if, he thought, the sea itself could be made to sing? What if the endless hum and vibration of noise could confuse the German U-boat's sonar, their deadly ears beneath the waves? It was ridiculous. He knew it. Who would listen to a cook talking about sonar warfare? But as the days passed and more ships in their convoy vanished, one torpedo just beyond the horizon, another burning in the distance, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Somewhere out there, German captains sat in silence, headphones pressed to their skulls, listening for British ships through the water's vibrations. If the cook could change those sounds, if he could make noise where there shouldn't be noise, or create echoes where there should be silence, maybe the U-boats would miss. He began experimenting in secret. At night, after the galley closed, he took old metal pots, filled them with water, and stirred them at different speeds. He dropped ladles, knocked pans together, even held one close to the ship's side, feeling the deep resonance of steel echo back through the liquid. The sound wasn't random. It had shape, depth, a strange harmony with the ocean itself. One evening, while testing with a pot half full of water, he noticed the pitch suddenly dip, creating a hollow vibration that lingered. That was when it struck him. The propellers of the U-boats worked on steady frequencies. If something could produce irregular underwater noise, metallic, rumbling, unpredictable, it could mask the sound of a convoy, like static on a radio drowning out a voice. The next morning, during ration distribution, he approached the ship's first officer, Lieutenant Grant, a sharp-featured man from Liverpool with no patience for nonsense. "Sir," the cook said, wiping grease from his hands, "I've noticed something about sound in the water." Grant barely looked up from his logbook. "Sound in the water? You mean the engine noise?" "Not exactly, sir," the cook continued carefully. "It's about how vibration carries. When the ship rolls, it changes how the sound travels through the hull. If we could create—" Grant interrupted with a tired sigh. "You've been reading too many penny papers, Cook. We're not fighting this war with pots and pans." The men nearby laughed. The cook smiled faintly, nodded, and returned to the galley. But inside, something burned. They could laugh, but he knew he was right. The ocean had a rhythm. He'd heard it in the pots. He just didn't yet know how to make others hear it too. When the convoy reached Liverpool, The cook disembarked with a letter of shore leave and a mind still racing. He walked through the fog-choked docks, past ships unloading ammunition and food, until he saw the naval recruiting office. Inside, behind a desk, an officer in spectacles looked up. "Name?" "Just Cook," he said. "I've got an idea about sonar." The officer frowned. "You're a cook?" "Aye, sir. Merchant Navy. Carnarvon Castle." The man almost laughed, but there was something in the cook's tone, steady, confident, that made him pause. "Go on," the officer said, leaning back. And so, in that small office smelling of tobacco and damp paper, the cook explained. He talked about sound propagation, vibration interference, and masking signatures, words he barely understood himself, but had felt through the steel of ships for years. The officer took notes, bemused but intrigued. When the cook left, the man filed the report under miscellaneous, acoustic observation civilian. No one expected anything to come of it, but weeks later, that paper found its way to the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Tiddington, where a physicist named Henry Pritchard happened to read it. Pritchard chuckled when he saw the author's description. Ship's cook, untrained observer. But then, halfway down the page, he stopped laughing. The idea was crude, yes, but the principle made sense. Noise masking through controlled interference. Artificial acoustic camouflage. The concept wasn't new. Engineers had discussed it, but no one had found a practical way to do it at sea. Yet here was a man, with no education in physics, describing how random vibrations might scatter sonar reflections. Pritchard ordered a test. Within a month, engineers were fitting prototype noisemakers, chains and steel rods, on the back of an old trawler towed behind a destroyer. When the devices rattled and churned underwater, the sonar readings from nearby U-boats went haywire. False echoes appeared. Depth charges missed. The German captains reported mechanical anomalies. The Admiralty had discovered its first acoustic decoy. They called it the Foxer. And somewhere, far from those laboratories, back in a Liverpool dockside pub, a cook sat quietly with a pint of bitter in his hand, unaware that his insane idea was now being tested in the Atlantic under a code name he'd never hear. He still signed onto ships, still peeled potatoes, still stirred soup. But the war had changed. Convoys that once vanished now made it home. U-boat kills declined. Hitler's wolfbacks began to lose their edge. And though the scientists and officers took the credit, one rumor persisted among sailors, that the idea for the Foxer came from a cook who heard the sea sing through a saucepan. They laughed at him once, but when his madness became Britain's shield, no one laughed anymore. In the months that followed, the Atlantic changed its voice. Where once the sea's depths had been silent and murderous, now there were echoes, ghostly clatters and low, metallic hums that confused even the most experienced German sonar operators. To them, it sounded as if the ocean itself had begun to lie. They called it das greenest am Wasser, the ghost in the water. And though they didn't know it, that ghost was born from a cook's observation made beside a boiling pot. The first deployment of the Foxer decoy came in mid-1943, aboard the destroyer HMS Duncan, part of an escort group tasked with protecting a convoy bound for Halifax. The system was crude. A set of hollow steel pipes and chains towed behind the ship, designed to create a chaotic underwater roar that masked the convoy's real acoustic signature. But in that chaos lay salvation. The U-boat stalking them, U-262, heard only the false echoes and fired its torpedoes blindly. They struck nothing. The convoy survived. In the Admiralty's reports, the entry was brief. Acoustic decoy system appears effective. Recommend further trials. No mention of who conceived the idea. Just one line in a report destined to change naval warfare. At sea, rumors traveled faster than orders. Sailors whispered of a sound box that fooled the enemy, a device that made U-boats chase ghosts. In the mess halls and on the lower decks, the myth grew. Some said it came from a scientist. Others swore it was a fisherman's trick. But one story, retold in ports from Greenock to Gibraltar, claimed it all began with a cook who noticed how boiling water spoke through steel. They laughed at him, men would say, leaning over their mugs of tea. But it's his madness that's keeping us alive now. Meanwhile, deep beneath the surface, the war had turned desperate for the Germans. Admiral Donnett's wolfpacks, once unstoppable, were now deafened by the roar of the decoys. Sonar pings returned nonsense. Propeller tracks vanished in clouds of false noise. U-boat commanders reported entire convoys disappearing mid-pursuit. In one intercepted transmission, a frustrated captain described the sea as alive with false voices. For the first time, the hunters were being hunted. British escorts began dropping depth charges on confused U-boats who had given away their position chasing phantom sounds. The tide of the Atlantic War shifted not with guns or new ships, but with noise. But victory at sea never came cheap. For every convoy that slipped through the U-boat nets, another was lost. The ocean was still a graveyard. Men still froze in oil-slicked waters, their last breaths stolen by the cold. Yet in those same waves, the echo of one man's idea endured, a sound between chaos and salvation. In early 1944, the Admiralty expanded the Foxer program across the fleet. Hundreds of ships towed the rattling devices behind them, turning the Atlantic into a symphony of confusion. The Germans responded with countermeasures, new torpedoes designed to ignore noise. But it was too late. The Allies had learned how to make the sea itself lie. The cook never saw the experiments. He was reassigned to smaller merchant routes, carrying cargo between British ports. To him, the war remained what it always had been: the rumble of engines, the stink of coal, the clang of pans. But sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, he would stand alone on deck, watching the black water slip by, and wonder if somewhere out there, a ship was safe because of him. He'd never know for sure. His idea had been swallowed by the system, passed from an office clerk to a scientist, to a lab, to a fleet, until no one could remember where it began. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that the convoys were making it home. Back in the Admiralty Research Laboratory, Pritchard continued refining the Foxer, unaware that his quiet observer, the nameless cook, still walked the docks of Liverpool. When the final blueprints were submitted for mass production, Pritchard added a small note at the bottom. Concept derived from field report, origin uncertain. It was the closest the cook would ever come to acknowledgement. The irony was almost cruel. In war, invention often came not from brilliance, but from desperation. And yet those who saw the world differently were rarely remembered. The cook's idea was dismissed, laughed at, and nearly forgotten before it became the sound that saved thousands. History would remember the Foxer as a triumph of engineering, not of intuition. But among sailors, the legend lived. There was a man, they'd whisper, a cook who heard music in metal. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic had transformed into an orchestra of mechanical shrieks and metallic echoes. Convoys moved like phantom fleets, shielded by sound. And as D-Day approached, the Foxer's influence reached its peak. It wasn't just ships that relied on it. Submarines, minesweepers, even landing craft were equipped with smaller versions of the device. The Germans grew paranoid, believing the British had developed a secret ocean weapon, something alive, something unnatural. Allied propaganda only fueled the myth, releasing distorted recordings of underwater noise that sounded eerily human, as if the sea itself were moaning. The psychological toll on U-boat crews was immense. Some refused to dive. Others reported hallucinations in the noise. The war beneath the waves had become a battle of nerves, and Britain had won it with a sound born from madness. And yet, in all this chaos, one truth remained silent: the origin of that sound. In late 1944, as the tide of war turned decisively toward the Allies, the cook was transferred to a hospital ship in the Mediterranean. His hair had begun to gray, and his hands, once steady, now trembled from years of vibration and heat. One night, while cleaning the galley, he overheard a young officer talking about the new Foxer system. The officer described how it saved dozens of ships, how it confused the Germans, how brilliant the scientists had been to invent it. The cook listened quietly, a faint smile crossing his face. "Aye," he murmured, "brilliant minds indeed." Then he returned to his pots, the steam rising like ghosts around him. He died before the war ended. A heart attack, the crew said, buried at sea with no ceremony, no mention in dispatches. The waves closed over him, indifferent. But the sound he imagined, the sound that confused machines and saved men, lived on. Even now, deep beneath the Atlantic, Fragments of those old decoy systems lie rusting in the dark. Chains, hollow pipes, twisted steel. When currents shift, they sometimes clatter softly, releasing faint metallic echoes that fade into the abyss. To those who listen closely, it almost sounds like laughter. Not cruel laughter, just the quiet irony of a man who was once dismissed as mad, whose idea became legend. They laughed at the cook, but the ocean never forgot his song. Night after night, the North Atlantic turned into a graveyard. Convoys stretched for miles, black silhouettes on restless waves, moving under the constant threat of unseen predators. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, the wolves were listening. The U-boats, their periscopes cutting through the mist, their sonar operators waiting for the faintest ping of a ship's screw. Each sound meant a target. Each echo meant death. And aboard one of those merchant ships, deep in the mess hall filled with steam, noise, and exhaustion, a cook stirred a pot of soup, unaware that his strange idea would soon turn the tide of an invisible war. The ship creaked, plates rattled, and outside, the wind howled like a warning. The cook wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an officer. He was just another forgotten face among thousands who fed the men keeping Britain alive. But he had been listening, not just to gossip or orders, but to the sound of the ocean itself. One night, as the convoy crawled through fog, depth charges rumbled in the distance. The crew froze, listening to the dull thuds beneath them. The cook, wiping his hands on a rag, muttered something odd, that the Germans weren't hunting by sight anymore, but by sound. The chief engineer laughed. Everyone laughed, but the cook didn't. He said it again, louder this time, explaining that every ship made its own kind of music, a rhythm, a beat, a pattern the U-boats could hear miles away. If only, he said, they could confuse that rhythm, make fake sounds that danced and shimmered through the water, maybe the wolves would chase ghosts instead of men. They laughed at the cook. The idea was madness. A kitchen worker telling the Navy how to fight submarines? But that night, when the U-boat struck again, and another ship vanished beneath the black water, a seed of doubt began to grow in one officer's mind. Could it be possible? Could sound itself be turned into a weapon or a shield? Weeks later, in a cold Admiralty office, a weary signals officer mentioned the cook's story over tea. The room chuckled at first, but one of the scientists from the research laboratory didn't laugh. He leaned back, stared at the wall map of the Atlantic, and said quietly, "Maybe he's not wrong." Soon, sketches appeared on chalkboards, metal tubes, cables, propellers, noisemakers that could mimic the propeller beats of ships. They called it the Foxer, or sometimes the FXR decoy, a device that screamed beneath the waves, luring U-boat torpedoes away from real ships. The first tests were crude. In the gray light of dawn, a small corvette towed the prototype through rough seas. The cable rattled, the machine groaned, and within minutes, the water behind the ship boiled with static. Sonar men pressed their headphones tighter. The Foxer made a chaotic roar, a jumble of sound that confused their instruments. If it confused them, it would confuse the Germans too. The moment came when the first U-boat fired. A torpedo streaked through the depths, locked onto the loudest sound it could find. But instead of hitting the ship, it curved toward the screaming decoy. A flash erupted far astern. The crew cheered. The Foxer worked. The insane idea from a cook, mocked, dismissed, forgotten, had saved them all. But out there, in the black Atlantic, no one knew the name of the man who first thought of it. The reports credited engineers. Admiralty documents listed laboratories. The cook's name disappeared into the fog, like so many ships before him. Yet among the crews, the story spread of the nameless sailor who heard the sea differently, who turned its deadly voice against itself. Some said he'd gone back to cooking on another ship. Others claimed he never made it home. Years later, when veterans gathered in quiet pubs, someone would always mention it, that strange day when a cook changed a war. And every time, someone would smile and say, "They laughed at him first." But the sea never forgets. Beneath the waves, where pressure crushes steel and sound travels faster than thought, the echoes of that invention still hum. The Foxer's mechanical scream became the heartbeat of survival, a ghostly rhythm pulsing through the deep. Even after the war, when U-boats lay rusting on the seabed, their sonar operators long gone, the echoes remained. Divers claim they can still hear it sometimes, a faint metallic wail that drifts through the dark water, like a machine remembering. The irony is almost poetic. A cook, a man trained to listen to boiling pots and rattling pans, had taught the Navy how to listen to the ocean. He turned chaos into defense. And somewhere in the archives, buried under layers of classified ink, his contribution remains unmarked. History rarely remembers those who weren't supposed to matter, but the ocean does. The scene shifts, black and white film grain, convoy ships crawling through mist, the hum of engines blending with a deep throb of sonar. A voice crackles through a radio. Enemy contact, bearing 065. Alarms blare. Men rush to stations. Then, silence. Except for that sound, the Foxer's haunting metallic chatter echoing through the water. The torpedo comes, fast, hungry, sure. It locks onto the sound. Then it vanishes into a burst of white foam. The convoy survives. Somewhere, the cook stands in a galley miles away, stirring another pot, unaware that his imagination has just saved dozens of lives. No medal, no record, just the faint satisfaction of knowing his crazy idea might not be so crazy after all. They laughed at him once, but now, in the depths where no light reaches, his laughter echoes back, carried by the very sound he taught the world to fear. The Atlantic grew colder as winter took hold. Ice clung to the decks, and the wind sliced through every seam of the ships like a knife. Convoys still sailed, still hunted, still hoped. But something had changed in the silence between the waves. The U-boats were listening, and now, what they heard was chaos. The Foxers screamed behind every ship, flooding the sea with metallic confusion. The sonar screens inside German subs flickered with false targets, endless noise that mocked their precision. Commanders cursed, engineers sweated, and Hitler's vaunted sea wolves began to miss their prey. Somewhere, in that cold madness, a cook's forgotten dream was doing what guns never could. It was saving lives by making sound into a shield. Far below the surface, inside a U-boat, the sound men strained over their instruments. They'd been tracking a convoy for hours, but every reading scattered into nonsense. Too much interference, one muttered. It's like the ocean screaming at us. The captain growled, pounding the periscope base. Fire anyway. A torpedo slid into the sea, then curved, twisted, and exploded harmlessly behind the last freighter. The sub shook from the pressure wave. Missed again, the captain hissed. Above them, the convoy continued, untouched, unaware that a ghost had fought for them. Meanwhile, in a small port town in Britain, the cook was no longer with the fleet. He'd been reassigned after an injury, a boiler accident. Just before the tests began, he never saw the Foxer in action. Every morning, he walked past the harbor, where gray ships came and went, their hulls scarred by salt and war. He'd hear the gulls, smell the diesel, and sometimes think of that day in the galley when he'd made everyone laugh. He didn't talk about it much. Men like him rarely did. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the sea, he'd pause and swear he could hear something faint beneath the waves. A strange hum, metallic and distant. On the ships, life went on. The crew learned to live with the constant noise of the Foxers, a harsh, grinding racket that filled the ocean behind them. Some said it was maddening, like a scream that never ended. But to others, it was the sweetest sound in the world, the sound of safety. As long as that thing's screaming, one sailor said, we're still alive. News began to spread through the ranks. The U-boats were pulling back. Convoys that once lost a dozen ships were now arriving almost intact. Admiralty reports called it acoustic deception technology. Officers wrote commendations, and scientists gave lectures. The papers praised British ingenuity, but no one mentioned the man who'd first thought, what if we just make more noise? One night, in a crowded mess hall, a group of sailors swapped stories over rum. Someone mentioned the old rumor about the cook who dreamed it all up. Most of them laughed. A cook? Come off it. These things were built by Oxford types, not galley boys. But an older sailor, his face weathered by years at sea, didn't laugh. No, he said slowly, staring into his drink. It was a cook. I was there when he said it. Everyone laughed, but I remember his face. Quiet sort. He meant it. The laughter faded. Outside, the wind moaned against the hull, and for a moment, no one spoke. They just listened to the low, steady hum of the decoy dragging behind them. It sounded almost human, almost alive. As the war raged on, the Foxer evolved. Newer models screamed louder, worked better, but the problem was, so did the enemy. The Germans tried countermeasures, new torpedoes that could think, could tell the difference between a decoy and a ship. It became a war of frequencies, of sound and silence, of deception and detection. The Atlantic was no longer just a battlefield. It was an orchestra of death. And through it all, the cook remained invisible. His name wasn't on any list, his story buried under secrecy and paperwork. But perhaps he preferred it that way. Perhaps, for him, it was enough to know that somewhere out there, men were coming home alive because of a thought that came to him while stirring soup. One foggy morning, years later, after the war had ended, a fisherman pulled an odd piece of metal from his net. It was rusted, twisted, full of holes. The markings were barely legible, FXR. He didn't know what it was, just tossed it aside. But that night, as his boat rocked gently on the tide, he swore he could hear something beneath the hull, a faint metallic whisper, like a machine still humming. Some say the sound never really stopped. Even today, sonar operators report strange echoes near old wrecks, rhythmic, patterned, like a heartbeat. Maybe it's just coincidence, or maybe it's the ocean remembering. The story of the cook never made it into the history books, but among sailors, it's told in hushed tones about the man who listened differently, who found genius not in laboratories, but in the rhythm of boiling water. They say that when you listen to the deep Atlantic through sonar, you can still hear the echoes of his idea, a distorted symphony of noise that once fooled the deadliest hunters of the sea. And if you close your eyes, you can almost see him there, standing in a narrow galley, apron stained, hands rough, staring into a pot as bubbles rise and burst, listening, thinking, creating a weapon no one could see, no one could touch, only hear. The irony still lingers. They laughed at him once, but the sound of his laughter became their shield. The wolves of the deep had met their match, and they never even knew his name. Years passed. The Atlantic grew quiet again. The convoys stopped sailing, and the ports that once roared with engines now stood silent except for the gulls. The world moved on. New wars began in deserts and skies, fought with satellites instead of sonar, and the sea, as always, swallowed its secrets. The old ships rusted away on the seabed, their hulls eaten by time, their propellers still, their noise gone. But in the deep, sound never truly dies. It lingers, bending, echoing, hiding inside the cold water like a ghost that refuses to be forgotten. Somewhere in that endless dark, the faint trace of an insane idea still drifts. In an archive basement decades later, a young historian leafed through forgotten Admiralty files. Most were stamped classified or destroyed after review, but one folder, yellowed and half-torn, caught his eye. Inside was a page of typed notes from 1943. Acoustic interference. Initial concept proposed informally by ship's cook Merchant Navy. No name, no ship, just that line, followed by a scribbled remark. Test to be considered by engineering division, though impractical. The historian smiled. A cook? He whispered. They really laughed, didn't they? He looked up at the ceiling, as if the ocean itself could hear him. But it worked. Outside, the rain lashed the windows of London, a sound like static, like sonar. And for a moment, the historian thought he could hear something faint beneath it. A deep hum, metallic, rhythmic, rising and falling like a breath from the deep. He shut the file and walked away, but the sound stayed with him, like a song you can't forget. Far out in the Atlantic, a research vessel drifted above the wreck of an old convoy escort. The crew lowered a probe, its sonar sending out pings that rippled through the dark. The display flickered, then came a strange echo, distorted, repeating every few seconds. "That's odd," said one technician. "No known structure down there." The captain frowned. "Could be debris?" The technician shook his head. "No, it's moving." The room went silent except for the rhythmic pulse of returning sound, an old signal, looping endlessly, a pattern that made no sense. But to anyone who had known the war, it would have sounded familiar. The sea was still talking. In a quiet coastal town, not far from where the cook once worked, an elderly woman stood by the cliffs at dawn. She'd been a nurse during the war, stationed at a naval hospital. She never met the cook, but she'd heard the story, whispered in canteens, half believed. As she watched the tide roll in, she closed her eyes and listened. The wind howled, the gulls cried, and far below, the surf roared against the rocks. Beneath it all, she imagined she could hear something else, a deep, humming undertone, steady and calm. She smiled faintly. "Still cooking," she murmured and walked away. Time erased faces, medals, names. But the ocean kept its memory, not in words or photographs, but in echoes. Each sonar ping that bounces off the seabed, each strange interference on a naval radar, all part of the same invisible legacy. The cook had never sought glory. He just wanted to help his ship survive. Yet in doing so, he gave the world one of the strangest and most effective weapons of the Atlantic War, and vanished from its history like mist over the sea. Somewhere tonight, deep beneath the waves, the old Foxer decoys still hang from forgotten wrecks, their chains tangled, their metal frames corroded. The current moves through them, creating faint, eerie vibrations. And when those vibrations reach the right frequency, they hum, a sound too faint for the surface, but enough for the deep. Enough to remind the ocean of what once happened there. They laughed at the cook, but when his insane idea fooled Hitler's U-boats, no one laughed again. His name erased, his voice unheard, but the sound he made still lives, echoing through time, hiding in the sea's dark heart. It's the sound of courage disguised as madness, the sound that saved 1,000 men and was never supposed to exist. And if you ever stand on a stormy coast, when the wind howls and the surf pounds the cliffs, listen closely. Between the thunder and the waves, you might just hear it, a low metallic hum, far away, steady as a heartbeat. The last whisper of a forgotten cook, still protecting the living from the hunters of the deep.